neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. The 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution.
We didn't really have a high rate of black incarceration prior to the emancipation. Once slavery ended, then the disproportionate numbers of black people in prison increased.
The person I think it affected the most is my older brother, Gregory, because he didn't have a father in his life. So yes, my mother was a strong woman, but I think if my father wasn't in jail, he wouldn't be the man he is now.
Black people were no longer slaves, so they were therefore no longer labor, and they were not needed in the same way, and they could be imprisoned, whereas before their labor was needed and used in a very different kind of way. So we've kind of disproportionately been targeted since at least the late 19th century within the prison system.
The penal system is an extension of old Jim Crow laws. The language of the 13th Amendment, I think, is really important, right? So when we talk about slavery except for involuntary servitude as a form of punishment, right? So these types of spaces around who becomes the target of criminality, right? So who becomes the criminal just by happenstance, not because of any action, but literally because historically this narrative has painted these particular group of people, black people in this case, as criminals.
Jail is nothing but modern day slavery, which you can get a slight synopsis of it, like, yeah, it is.
Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, exclusion from jury service, suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it.
The building of prisons has been looked upon as an economic engine. So small towns are being fed this idea of, well, if you all need jobs, just let us drop this prison here. Prison has become big industry in terms of its relationship to the U.S. economy.
Because you work for pennies a day, and you shacked up, you locked up in the shed, if you want to call it that.
Right, so if you're paying somebody 20 cents an hour, that's essentially free in terms of production costs, in terms of the profit margin you get based on what you sell.
But I feel it's like, I don't like it. Definitely won't be going back.
If we look at private prisons, so now they're actually exporting labor or contracting with big firms to actually produce their products. So this now becomes essentially a new slave economy.
In my opinion, I fear that the incarceration rates for African Americans will continue to increase unless we as a nation think about this issue and get real about this issue. The statistics show that what led to this increase in the incarceration of African Americans in the past has been this war on drugs. And what we're dealing with now is this emergence of a war on guns. Now the reality is the way that's going to play out, and the way I've seen it play out, is that people being picked up for possessing a gun because they have a prior felony conviction are African Americans. And that's going to lead to more incarcerations unless we think about the impact of these laws before we start making them.
The way they're currently designed, they're much more harmful than they are restorative institution.
It's my belief that prison makes everything worse, and that it doesn't actually work to do anything except for disappearing people.
I think it depends on the person. And yeah, I think punishes the person for the crime that they have committed, but I also think it sets them up to commit other crimes.
I think in the current state, they are used solely to house populations for extended periods of time without any transition into society.
And actually, they're not living up to the goal of rehabilitation like we'd hope that they would.
It's crowd control. If one race is doing too much, yeah, we're gonna lock them up for anything.
Or if you're cynical, they probably work to harm and oppress groups that you don't really want to deal with.
And actually promoting recidivism, returning, in opposed to actually staying out of those places.
It leaves the social problems that are the root causes of why people get into trouble with the law in the first place. It leaves those things untouched and usually unsolved.
In terms of my feelings about high incarceration rates, I think it's really important to understand that as a legacy of history. Michelle Alexander just wrote this book, The New Jim Crow, and something that she puts out, and I actually heard from a professor about 13 years ago now, and she makes this point that there are currently more people incarcerated, more black people incarcerated than were listed as slaves in 1850. I think it's important to look at the factors that influence incarceration. So if we look at it as layers, right? So education, definitely one without question. Poverty, lack of access to resources, definitely one without question. Segregation in cities in terms of neighborhood segregation.
And instead of arming people with education and drug rehabilitation and things that might prepare them for their future, in fact, basically prison becomes a form of incapacitation in which people don't live their lives, they don't have any opportunity to gain life skills, and it ends up being very detrimental for them.
We have to look at the lack of education and its connection to incarceration, because some of the stuff that we even see in Chicago, so we always think about the threshold year of a young person completing high school being 10th grade. But in Chicago, we've seen that the threshold is actually between 7th and 9th grade.
Now, when we look at reentry programs, if someone joins one of those programs and they actually are successful in finding a job, if they have that job for just 30 days, their recidivism rate drops down to 20%. And if they're able to keep that job for a year, it drops down to 16%.
The concept and idea of reentry is a problematic one. And the reason I say that is because for most people who end up behind bars, they were never integrated into society in the first place. So the question is, reentering into what? Reentering into communities that are incredibly poor, reentering into communities that don't have any resources, going back into places which you came out of, which were terrible for you in the first place. Reentering what is the question.
You got to go through certain steps and processes in order to get your life back, because once you go to jail, your life is gone. They took your life from you. Like, you definitely ain't finna do nothing to like outbeat what they done said you did.
The fact that in Illinois, according to Department of Correction statistics, in 2011, over 50% of the prison population was African American, with only 29% of the prison population being white.
My brother Gregory was incarcerated for drug-related reasons, maybe 7 to 8 times.
Class X sentence, which means you've committed 2 prior crimes in Illinois, that's a mandatory 6 to 30 years.
They took like at least about 11 or 12 years out of my life, but the last bit was like almost 3 years.
Traditionally, black people have been more likely to be in a situation where we've had less resources, and a lot of crime is derivative crime, meaning that it's something that you actually do because you need to survive and you're trying to find a way to survive. And so Black people tend to be more criminalized.
I think one of the obstacles that is very prevalent is what we call felony disenfranchisement, right? So in Illinois, there are about 52 positions that you can't hold if you have a class C through X felony. So you can't be a baker, can't be a barber, can't be a carpenter, can't be an electrician.
We are incarcerating an entire generation of African Americans, and their potential to go out and impact the world in a positive way is really being lost.